Reuel Schiller is a professor here at Hastings and a pretty good 1L advisor. Giving his speech, The Tragic Death of Liberal Arts, Professor Schiller.
Thank you. Pretty good advisor. So my talk is inspired by an odd media coincidence. On the same episode of NPR's All Things Considered were two different stories. And the first story was about an economist at MIT who was examining what sorts of jobs are being replaced by technology. The purpose of this was to figure out what sort of jobs were safe, right? What fields would you want to go into to not worry about being made technologically obsolescent? And he found, of course, that many jobs are being pushed aside by technology, but he identified particular types of activities that computers were not very good at. And in particular, it was what he called ideation, right? That is, coming up with ideas, innovating, hypothesizing. Computers, it seems, are pretty good at getting answers, but they're not very good at asking questions, right? So any of the sorts of fields where you're engaged in that sort of creative, innovative thinking are fields that he concluded, you're safe to advise your children to go into. So that was the first. That was the first thing I heard. And the second story was about these different political attacks on liberal arts education that were happening in the country, that have been happening recently in the country. The particular story was about the governor of Florida, who had suggested a new funding formula for the state university system that would prioritize what he called useful subjects over others. And George, I'm sorry to say, his quote was, "Our state does not need any more anthropologists." Right, and the story talked about similar funding formulas in Texas and North Carolina. The North Carolina one was particularly grotesque. It was the idea that university departments should be funded according to whether majors in those departments were able to get jobs or not, right, as the basis for their funding. And I have to say, I was enjoying my usual haughty, liberal sort of eye-rolling at this nonsense disguised as public policy, when suddenly President Obama joined the chorus, right, suggesting that students were wasting their time studying art history, that they should study something else that was more useful. So here in this story, we actually found something that Obama and the Tea Party can agree upon, right? No more literature majors in college. Instead, it seems our leaders are on board with the vocationalization of higher education, right? That everything should be self-evidently and instrumentally useful that you study in college. Well, those of you who know anything about me know that this second story hit pretty close to home, right? I'm a professionally trained historian. I study legal history. The last thing I need is for people to be telling me that my discipline is useless, right? The idea that our leaders want to push us along this road to a society where all education is nothing more than an instrument for the furthering of our particular brand of neoliberal capitalism is terrifying to me, right? The liberal arts teach us some of the most basic principles of humanness, right? The ability and willingness to imagine the world from another's perspective, a skeptical view of the present's truths, the central role that self-reflection has in informing a person's actions, the tenets by which an ethical life is lived, right? The assertion that aesthetic appreciation of the universe and what it contains is a worthwhile pursuit, regardless of its pedestrian utility. Right? The fewer people who are systematically taught these principles, the shallower and the more hollow our society will become. Well, that's my sort of ideological belief, but what's the link to the first story, right? The story about where there are going to be jobs because of technology. Well, it's this. The things that liberal arts education teaches you, in fact, provide precisely the skills that computers and technology have the greatest problems replacing, right? Imagination, empathy, creative thinking, persuasion, making connections and innovations that are so non-obvious that they are difficult to arrive at, even with the brute force, methodical testing of options that computers are so good at. Right, so do you see the problem? Right, the problem, it's not simply that attacks on the liberal arts, right, this vocationalism that is permeating higher education. The problem is not simply that it will lead to an ethically bankrupt hollow culture, although it will lead to an ethically bankrupt hollow culture. Right, the problem is that this attack on liberal arts, right, is that vocationalism cannot even do what its advocates want it to do. Pushing people away from the liberal arts is pushing them away from the very skills that humans need in our increasingly technologically based society. The things that computers will never be able to do is what liberal arts education teaches people how to do. Right? Vocationalism in higher ed will end up educating people primarily for jobs that will not exist. Now, legal education is not immune from this tendency. And over the next couple of years, you're going to hear a lot about skills training. The ABA will soon require 6 units of such training in law school. Starting in 2018, the state of California will require 12 units as well. Now, don't get me wrong. Skills training is not inherently bad. In fact, far from it. Right? When done correctly, it teaches students to be creative, compassionate, ethical lawyers. There's no question in my mind of that. But you need to be careful, because done wrong, right, skills training will become a form of legal vocationalism that will provide a legal education devoid of humanity, and that will do nothing more than prepare lawyers for jobs that no longer exist. Thank you.